You're about to listen to an episode of the Leadership Melting Pot podcast, brought to you by Lumerous. Engage with us as we dissect an aspect of leadership and see how you may apply some of what is shared across your business. All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to our Lumerous Forum. My name is Romeo Effs, and I'm the CEO here at Lumerous. Lumerous is a global management consulting firm that works with companies in the space of corporate governance, company secretary services, and ESG consulting. And this is our monthly Lumerous Forum, where we discuss topics related to governance, related to sustainability, related to social responsibility, or just responsible business practices in general. And today we'll be dissecting and looking at the topic of how corporate governance impacts stakeholder trust, but more so from a practical standpoint, not the usual kind of academic viewpoint of this. You know, we'll be talking to a real life practitioner in the space who can give us some more practical insights of how this actually works rather than what the business school says about all of this. And I'm so pleased to be joined by Phil Smith. Phil, to me, stands as a beacon of leadership and innovation within the tech space and business generally, not just here in the UK, but globally. Phil is currently the chair of IQE PLC, a leading force in the semiconductor wafer industry. And we all know the importance that semiconductors have become over the past couple of years, and the global kind of battle that's taking place as far as that is concerned. Prior to this, Phil was CEO and chair of Cisco UK and Ireland, where he played a pivotal role in shaping Cisco's impact across the region and globally as well. He has also been chair of Innovate UK and the Tech Partnership, which helps to underscore, and I think he brings his expertise to help to underscore his unwavering dedication to propelling innovation across the UK. He's also a member of the Digital Economic Council, where he leads insights to further enhance the digital era across the country. And he occupies a number of advisory board spaces, Lloyd's Registry, the University of Coventry, etc. And he is the non-exec chair of Appiway and Striva, and also a board member of UK Cloud. I would not, I want to have anyone else on discussing this topic, to be honest with you, because the other thing I really, really like about Phil is that he's very candid. He tells it as it is, and that's the kind of person in our book that makes really good guests for our forums, but also makes really excellent chairs as well to help to drive the agenda of better governance forward. So, Phil, welcome, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Romeo. Appreciate it. Nice to be here.
Good. I think we'll just kick off straight away in terms of just saying, how do you think stakeholder trust plays a significant role in the success and sustainability of an organization? Let's start from there, and then we can then drill down to the board.
Yeah, so thank you for that. And as you and I were chatting earlier, and as you rightly said in your preamble here, I bet you there's a lot more people on this call here who are much greater experts in corporate governance than me, including yourself, obviously. But in terms of what I do and what I've done, then my sense is that in business generally, that trust is one of the absolute key factors to success. And and so that means trust. If employees trust you, or if customers trust you, or if stakeholders trust you, and those stakeholders might be investors, then you have a very different relationship from one where we lack in trust. And I think that's something that we all have to reflect on. And I do often think about, which is that if people really trust you, that allows you to take different approaches to things. It allows people to stick with you for the longer term, and so on. And so I think that stakeholder trust, so people who are, and stakeholders by definition of the word are people who have a stake in your company or your organization, they want to feel that they trust you to deliver what you need to deliver for them.
Yeah.
And different stakeholders will have different perspectives on that. If you're an employee, a lot of it's about, what does it mean for me? What are you going to do for me, Mr. Company, and what am I going to do for you? And how do we get that clear? And there's some interesting reflections on that and what we did at Cisco and that, which was quite interesting. So
yeah, I mean, so a lot of people, this is now the era of shifting away from shareholders more towards stakeholders. But there's still the tendency to see the shareholder as more important than the rest of the stakeholders in the business. What's your take on that? Should one be more important than the other, or is it a balancing act?
Yeah, I mean, I think like most business, it is a bit of a balancing act. I mean, obviously shareholders or people who, have funded the company are vitally important. You can't ignore that, and you can't do without it, clearly. But I think even shareholders themselves would recognize that if you don't nurture the things which provide, health in a company, then the shareholder is this kind of it's a moot point, if you will. One of the things that we often talk about is the sort of difference between performance and health. But the fact that you really need both of those, you can have performance in a company. Shareholders will be happy if you're performing and growing revenue and all that sort of stuff. But the truth is that unless you're healthy, then performance is at best going to be transient and potentially even fatal, if you will, if you extract performance over anything else.
Right.
And we know that, as human beings, probably everybody could. I do a lot of cycling and stuff. So, probably everybody could, get on a bike and cycle 100K, but they would probably, die after it or be pretty close to dying. Or they could maybe do it once or twice. So you can drive performance out of people just through, pure motivation. But actually, if you really generate health, then someone can do something more regularly and they can continue to perform. And that's definitely true of companies. If you focus just on performance, which often is characterized by what shareholders want, that's great, but it's not going to last over the longer period. So if you're looking for sustainability in the sense of a company, then you really need performance and health.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned earlier about, some of the things that the thing is that you have this kind of unique position because you have also, you've been on both sides of the coin, for want of a better word, right? You've been on the executive side as an exec director, and then you're also on the side of being, a non-exec director. And you mentioned earlier about some of the things that you guys or you and your team did at Cisco around the first point around, the balancing act around stakeholders. Are there any examples that you could share?
Yeah, I mean, in that case, to be honest, it was looking more at employees as stakeholders. I mean, obviously, which was a very interesting exercise because, when you look at how you motivate staff, I mean, I think most people who run companies would say that if they can get the culture and the engagement of staff right, and staff is everything, from the, the directors right down to people who are, doing any job in the company, that if you can get that right, then it's much easier to be successful because you don't have to, as we said before, be driving just for performance. You're driving for performance and health. And at Cisco, we did some interesting work around what often is described now as a kind of employee value proposition. What is it? What is this company about? And, employee value proposition is a bit of a jargon term nowadays. And I think if you treat it as that, a bit like anything in business, if you treat it as, all right, we're going to do that, and that's us done, we'll put it up on the website, off you go. Let's do diversity. Okay, we do that. We're going to do a little bit of initiative, put it up on the website. That doesn't work, all right? Yeah. So a company's employee value proposition, when we did it at Cisco, we created a thing called the Cisco People Deal, where we said, essentially, what does the company do for me and what do I do for the company? Can we put that in real English it's just easy for people to digest and understand the vision, not just, in the days John Chambers standing up and spouting away about all this amazing stuff we're doing to transform the world. If you sit in finance in the company, or you're a director in the company, or you're a salesman in the company, it's like, what does that mean to me? What am I doing to change the world? And so employee value proposition, or sort of clear communication and trust, was really about saying, what's my role in this? What am I going to do? And so what we did is we pushed that thing down to every department and said to the department, if you're a finance department, or you're a legal department, or you're the manufacturing department, what does that language mean to you? What are the things that's going to engage you? So I think a lot of trust is built by people recognizing what it means to them, rather than simply a sort of blanket statement on a website, or a corporate vision, or whatever it might be. So
I couldn't agree with you more. I think one of the most critical points I think you mentioned, or I'm picking up from what you've just said, is the notion of communication. You mentioned simple language and building trust, especially among stakeholders. That is extremely critical, to explain to them exactly how this engagement work and what they're going to get out of it, really.
No, exactly. I mean, we all know that as human beings. It's terrible if you don't get communicated with. You're in an airport and you're delayed. You'd rather be told than just sit there going, okay, so what's happening now, And that's true in companies. It's true of customers. It's true of employees. It's true of stakeholders and shareholders. Now, you can't say everything to everybody. Of course you can't. You can't go into all the details of nuances to every shareholder, because it doesn't make sense to do it. But for what they need to understand things, and what board directors need from the executive or from investors is a sort of open communication, understanding, what everyone needs. So.
Do you think that boards, what's the board's role in stakeholder engagement and helping to build that trust? Because some people might see this more from the exec directors point of view, in terms of the senior leadership team. They're the ones that are working more with suppliers, with customers, with employees, but the board, as I've always said, I think the board is the custodian of the culture of the entire organization, which includes the whole notion of ethics and trust. So what's the board's role, do you think, in stakeholder engagement and building trust?
Yeah, it's definitely something that's evolving and changing, and it has, I think, a bit of, it's got some way to go, I think, is the truth. Because, if you're a board member, a non-exec board member, if we're sort of talking in that sort of concept, that context, if you're a non-exec board member, I mean, you're obviously engaged in various things over time, but by definition, you're not in the company every day. You're in there, you're preparing for having board meetings, having other discussions, committees, etc., around board meetings. So by definition, you're not in the company. So you're not in the company in operation every day, and you shouldn't be, because that's not the job of a non-exec director.
Yes.
But I think, to your point, I think that if you're looking at a company, then the holistic nature of the company is something you want to have visible to you. And of course, there's been moves in recent times to have, for example, directors who have got responsibility for employees. Obviously you've got functional people like audit committee chairs and REMCOM chairs and all that sort of stuff. But the reality is that the board has to see the picture of trust for stakeholders is important to the health of the company. And given that they're the custodians of the strategy and the governance of the company, then obviously that's an important thing to be focused on. So, but I think you have to be sort of realistic about whether that person is going to be, day to day talking to everybody in the company. Now, my general tendency when I'm involved, I'm very happy to talk down through organizations, and if people would like to chat to me or the board or whatever, or I would like to chat to them, I really enjoy doing that. And I think it's always very helpful to sort of, decode a little bit what you've heard through the executive into, well, actually, what's really happening? How do you feel about this? That's something to do. But obviously you do need to make sure you don't start to undermine the executive's capability. If you're a CEO or an HR director or whatever, you don't really want the board kind of going in and dabbling and tell people how the strategy is different from this and the performance looks all from what they're hearing. You want to be congruent with that, and so as much as possible supporting what the company are doing on areas like ESG and so on, and supporting it rather than saying, you're day-to-day down working in with people on issues of, social engagement or environmental sustainability or even, departmental governance or whatever. So I think the point is entirely right. You have to be see it as something holistic, but you have to find the balance of where you sit versus what the executive are doing.
There's a question that just came in, which I think it can fit into this, and it's about the structure and composition of company boards. And if you think that helps to influence, how this whole notion of stakeholder trust is built. And you kind of alluded to it in terms of having people on the board responsible for diversity or for ESG, etc. But do you think the composition of a company's board of directors influence stakeholder trust in any way?
Yeah, it must do, mustn't it? Because, if you, like everything in a company, if you're looking up to a board and you don't think that board is credible either because it doesn't represent what you think the company's about, or it doesn't have expertise in particular areas, or it doesn't seem to take any account of the things you care about, then people are going to be suspicious of that. That will either be employees or stakeholders or shareholders or whomever. So of course it does. And there are limitations to what you can do. You can't have, in the companies I chair, for example, the board's not massive. You only got 4 or 5 people on the board. So you can't have everything. We'd all like to have the most diverse boards with the most expertise. That would be really good. But in reality, you need to sort of find a balance as much as you possibly can that allows you to execute on what you're doing whilst being understanding, relevant to the stakeholders you need to get involved in. We all know the classic stories, not so much of boards, but of company leadership teams of, if you're trying to attract talent into an organization, a young woman who wants to join a company and looks up and sees everybody in leadership positions as men, white men, what's their perception? They're going to look at that and go, great, okay, it's a great company, I really buy into it, but actually, is there really a place for me in the future? What if I leave and have a baby and come back? Is it really going to work for me? So I think you have to make people feel things are accessible. And I think the composition is one way of signaling that as a sort of external, we've got someone who's got this capability. Yeah. But I think more in the way that the board communicates again or talks is more powerful, that if people feel that they can engage with that, because I think leadership overall in the 21st century is much more about accessibility and authenticity and so on than it's about hierarchy and structure and so on. I think that's not something the 21st century relates to as well, and I think people relate much more to recognition of values and so on. So I think that's an important part.
Do you think the other thing that jumps to mind is the breakdown of non-exec versus exec? Do you think that the fact that if the board has more non-execs on it versus exec, it gives the perception that it's more balanced, and therefore what comes out of the board would be more trusted? Do you think that?
Obviously the corporate governance rules, if you're in a public company, say that that must be the case. So you must have more independents than non-independents, right? Exec versus non-exec, but an independent non-execs versus execs. And of course, the reason for that is just so that you can't kind of overwhelm the board with execs voting on, we want to get the remuneration double for everybody, and you can kind of vote it on majority. It's not quite as simple as that, but that's in essence the set issue that to address. So you need kind of independence of people saying, we've got an independent board who are trying to make sure that what the company is doing, fits within fits within the right boundaries and policies and guidelines that the corporate governance is all about.
Yeah.
So I think it is important, and that's a good example of the constitution of the board simply being more independent than non-independent. But yeah, you're right. But it's sort of more than that, isn't it? It's more a sort of signal of independence and not being sort of dragged down into stuff which is just about the day-to-day of the company. It's more about is it actually fitting into society and doing all the things it needs to do.
As you mentioned that, though, I mean, what are some of the things that you see as a chair and sitting on some of these boards? Some of the critical factors that stakeholders are concerned about, that would influence trust in the company or in the board, really.
Yeah, it is interesting because, as you said at the very beginning, it's a kind of. It's a really difficult balance to strike. I mean, obviously, companies and shareholders and everybody else want companies to perform and, return for whatever it is. If you're an investor, you want, your investment to grow. If you're an employee, you want to have a fulfilling time. If you're a customer, you want a great experience and so on. And I think that, boards, have to wrestle with the balance of making sure that that the company fits within whatever governance boundaries there are, and obviously for public companies those are more visibly scrutinized than private companies and smaller companies and so on. But you can't, it's sort of not an excuse, if you know what I mean. It's too easy to sort of make it a bit of an excuse. And this is a dialogue you have at board all the time. It's like, okay, we have to announce this because of X.
Yeah.
Because, it's a disclosable event. Well, that's true, and you do have to do that, and we obviously, would always do that within the context of the companies I'm involved in. But it's kind of like, well, why is it a disclosable event? It's a disclosable event because it affects people's shareholding, or it affects people's jobs, or it affects people's whatever. So the trick is not to get too sort of tied up in the kind of process side of it and realize that this is, as clumsy as it can be sometimes, the corporate governance guidelines and so on, they're sort of trying to achieve the right thing. And you want to sort of go with that rather than try to resist it all the time. Because if you're sort of resisting it, then there's probably something wrong with what you're doing. You're actually trying to do something that's different. Maybe you're not on the right market. Shouldn't be listed at all. You should be, private company. Maybe you shouldn't have a board. Whatever. It's a difficult balance, and it is a difficult thing for boards to deal with. And I know. I think we've talked before, but internationally, it's got different perceptions. Things like remuneration and so on. When I've sat down in a few forums in recent times, talking about remuneration and the latest sort of issues on it. Yeah. And interesting enough, you end up talking a lot of time about, public to private. People taking companies private because they're struggling not with remuneration as such, but with the whole way that you build the incentives, particularly for technology companies. We saw ARM, for example, who were listed, taken private by SoftBank, then relisted again, so on. And, technology companies, you can sort of see the attraction of that. Some of the longer term bets you have to make, the capital investments versus other things, are quite tricky for a shareholder who might be more short term focused on looking at monthly, quarterly, yearly performance.
Absolutely.
That doesn't quite work for them. So now, that doesn't mean that the rules are wrong. It just means that the situation you're in needs to be adapted to be successful,
Yeah, I mean, we do a lot of work around stakeholder engagement with boards, and it's almost like a minefield because shareholders have a different set of things that are important to them. Employees have a different set of things that are important to them. Then you have the consumers who, in this age of social justice and ESG, has a completely different set of things that they're concerned about. And then the suppliers that you also have to deal with to ensure that you are meeting things around human trafficking and
modern
slavery, all of that kind of stuff. And then the communities that you're working again are then adding the additional pressure. So, I know it can be a really kind of balancing act, and it's really tight. And you might please one set of stakeholders, and then the other set comes to you from a completely different standpoint.
Yeah.
We just need to look at what's happening right now in terms of our energy, and whether or not we should drill offshore or not. One bit, the climate stakeholders are saying no, but then everyone else, some other people are saying, but we need this because we need to become energy dependent. So I can just imagine where that is concerned. Do you have any examples that you could share with us in terms of, best practices in terms of this kind of stakeholder management and building trust, or if not case studies, just some of the things from you? We mentioned about effective communications earlier. Some of the things that you think boards and chairs should be doing around, as a best practice to build trust among stakeholders.
Yeah, I mean, we've obviously seen all the big examples in the past of bad practice in here. The VW Dieselgate thing, or as it's called, Enron, all those sorts of things. And they obviously resulted in fairly major legislative changes in, Sarbanes-Oxley and all those sorts of things that appeared as a result of that, which probably meant that the pressures that we've talked about had sort of forced companies to sort of gradually behave different. Well, there was probably, there were structures beforehand, obviously, which in theory governed all this stuff. But it was clear that in the modern world of the way that the complexity of global businesses, the revenue flows, the different legislative environments and so on, that actually those weren't really fit for purpose in the 21st century. And that came about via major failures, but obviously it was when that new regulation came in, everybody's like, oh my god, this is so hard and we've got to do all these things and so on. But it was probably a bit of a kind of shock of like, okay, we need to upgrade ourselves to the next generation. And I think there are, when we look at those sorts of things, it's interesting. It's a bit like the whole discussion at the moment around AI. That regulation shouldn't be something that stops innovation happening. It should be something that makes innovation happen because, the markets are more successful and so on. And so I think when it comes to, sort of good examples of things, there have clearly been environments in companies where people have done a good job of communicating with their employers, with their customers and stakeholders about changes that we're making and so on. I remember back in the day, people like Adobe, when they sort of kind of went online, they sort of took a bit of a dip, but they were quite clear about signaling that they were going to do that because they were going to go from a sort of a very specific kind of product base to an online base. And, they did a good job of kind of navigating that. And there was others, clearly, they were, the Netflixes and so on of the world who, went from a completely different business of shipping out the to people to an online business, who kind of managed expectations and gradually brought people on board. And I think those things are powerful. They're not that easy to do. I mean, in big shifts like that, you can see it, but in more subtle shifts, and I think, the sort of boundary between communication and regulation and so on will become really, really important. I mean, we've obviously seen, as I say, things like AI, and there's a lot of discussion in Senate and in government here and so on about, whether we should regulate, AI companies and large language models and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
But we've definitely seen that kind of thing in the past where, some of those things have not been regulated as well and have caused problems. GM Foods and so on was a good example, but it just was, the communication was terrible. Yeah. HS2, I mean, HS2, the big flaw in the HS2 is they called it HS2, in my view. They shouldn't have called it high speed 2 because it's not really about high speed, it's about capacity. Yes, but the whole thing, the way that was communicated was bad, and it just made itself a bit of a whipping boy for anything, I mean, anything, that was nasty came back on that. So, but, there was good examples. I mean, it's slightly more esoteric than company boards, but, when the human fertilization and embryology part talked about stem cells, the regulator worked really closely with business and managed to navigate through that very complex area. And I think with AI and energy, as you described, and climate, generally, we're going to have to find a way where businesses use regulation and governance to manage the way they're doing things, but they have to do that in cooperation, or else we're going to end up with, policemen telling people not to do things rather than finding ways of enabling businesses to be successful.
Yeah. I mean, I'm happy you brought up the whole notion around technology, because that was another point I was jumping into, because we had a few weeks ago, we did a podcast, and one of the around trends in corporate governance, and one of the big discussions was around how technology is kind of disrupting the whole space of how boards operate, the hybrid meetings, the availability of papers for boards, that kind of stuff. And AI is also helping to drive that. I mean, do you think that, or in what way do you think that boards could use technology in a much better way to help to engage more with stakeholders and kind of up the ante of building this trust? Is there any way, as someone who is in the tech space?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to do with technology is not to always see it as either, a whizzy thing that somebody else does or a threat. I had a really interesting conversation a number of years ago with Willie Walsh, who's the
former CEO of BA,
and then on to AIG and so on. And we were chatting. I was at Cisco at the time, and we were talking about video, and telepresence and all the stuff we're doing now. Obviously everybody does it now because of COVID, but this was back in probably early 2000s. Yeah. And I was talking to him about it, and I said, I know Willie. I mean, I'd known him for a while, and I said, I know that, this obviously just looks like a bit of a threat to you because, people don't have to fly and all that sort of stuff. And he said, no. He said, I think the airlines, when the internet came around initially, we assumed it was a big threat to us and it was going to take away revenue and blah, blah, blah. In reality, it was the biggest boon to airlines ever because people booked their own flights. They, managed their own things. So actually, the efficiency that it brought to the airline industry was huge. Yes. And it would have been easy to just say, no, we don't. And a lot did say, we don't want to do anything with this. It's technology, go away. It's, we've got a business we're doing. And I think, video was the same, which said, well, okay, we're going to use video. We're all going to use it. But in reality, we and you and I did last week, get together face to face, and that's important as well. So how do you blend that with what modern world really needs? And AI is a brilliant example. I was sitting next to someone yesterday and we were chatting about, she was in sort of marketing communications and so on. Yeah. And you say, well, okay, like ChatGPT. I mean, you could chuck something at ChatGPT and it comes out with this amazing piece of text and plans and all that sort of stuff. And, to my eyes, and we were discussing, that's brilliant. So that means I don't have to sit down and grind out a 2-page document. I can go and say, just give me this. It's a draft. I'll use it and then I'll modify it however is appropriate. And so I think, there's a lot more to AI than that, obviously. But the truth is that if you start to look on the front foot about how to embrace models, you're going to have a much more success than you are if you just go, whoa, threat, the world is changing. Cars have come around. So, we're not going to use, that's a big threat. Phones are a big threat. People are not going to talk anymore. Well, funnily enough, they talked a lot more. Banks are getting automated, or we don't need banks anymore. Well, funnily enough, with banks. So I think it's a case of embracing. And I think with boards and the stakeholders, the way they communicate, I think there's a real danger that people say, no, we have to write to shareholders in this particular way and they have to be spoken at. Well, maybe not. Maybe a shareholder actually would rather get a WhatsApp message or whatever, because that's the way they're living their lives, and that, they want to see it that way, or a video cast or a whatever, because that's the way. Now, there are governance things around that. You can't, communicate certain things for financial reasons, obviously. Yes. And so on. But, outside of those sorts of constraints, let's not limit ourselves by not using technology. I used to joke, a lot of customers when I was at Cisco used to talk to me about, social networking and how they banned Facebook, for example, at work. And it's like, really? I said, yeah, why have you done that? And they said, well, they're on Facebook, people sitting on Facebook all the time. And I was saying, well, to me, that's a management issue. That's not a technology issue. What you've just hired a load of young people who are brilliant at collaborating with each other. They can create groups, they can message better and so on than anybody else can do it. And you've just basically cut their legs off and said, hey, I'll use Outlook. I'm like, what? What have you done to me? So, and I remember actually, just a similar sideline, but I had a conversation with the CIO of the British Army, who was the same, and he was saying that when they're in base, all the young people and others all use, instant messaging and WhatsApp and whatnot to communicate, and then you deploy them out to somewhere, and they haven't got all that. And so the whole kind of structure of how they communicate falls apart on it.
Yes.
Good, which was a good opportunity for us at Cisco. We used to just drop big containers in that were full of Wi-Fi, and it would just suddenly be Wi-Fi'd up, and they could use all this stuff. So, but it's an interesting example of where it would be easy to say, don't do that because it's technology and it's threatening and blah, blah, blah. Whereas actually, if you think about it creatively, there's a lot of things you can do with technology that would enhance, writing documents, reading documents.
Yeah.
I often read documents in the car because I've got a text-to-speech reader, and it just reads the documents. Well, that's a lot easier than me than sitting and taking an hour when I haven't got an hour to sit and read the document. So
completely. I mean, for example, with us, we have a minute taking service as well, and we use technology where that is concerned, and the minutes gets turned around much faster because the AI is there transcribing as the meeting is happening, and you are able to then produce the minutes quite quickly. You mentioned something about regulation and the whole notion of reporting. Do you think regulation has the new regulation that's coming, stuff like, consumer duty, or, the new ESG regulations coming, or the ones in the past? Do you think that those regulations helped in any way, and the onerous reporting that has come on the back of that, helped in any way in building and enhancing this whole issue of engagement and trust with the wider stakeholders?
That's a very good question, because a bit like we said earlier on, I think the intent is absolutely right. They're trying to make sure that data is available and that people have it and they can engage with it and so on. But it's pretty onerous at the moment. And that doesn't mean it's wrong, but it does mean that we've probably not got ourselves into the position where it's become part of what we do in business, all time. And so I think, the sort of birthing pains that you have with any sort of new regulatory environment are tricky. I mean, GDPR is a great example, isn't it? When GDPR came around, it was like, we've got to do all this and define data owners and blah, blah, blah. But actually, in reality, we know that GDPR, has probably protected and, guided business models, and means that, well, we still get a load of spam, but, the sort of stuff that we would have got in people's ability to just take data and ruthlessly use it. And given you've got, multi-trillion-dollar companies who are taking data and, really want to use it as much as possible, having something like GDPR is powerful. But in the birth of GDPR, it was really like, whoa, this is really hard work. It's going to take a lot of extra work for companies and so on to get into place. So it was more, and a bit like Sarbanes-Oxley and all those things, it was something that at the time, it was a sort of tectonic shock. You had to move up to a whole other level. But actually, hopefully that normalizes over time and it doesn't become as onerous, or it's built into the way you're doing business, or
the BAU of the business.
The technology you're using automatically generates stuff. I mean, ESG is a great example, because all of this sort of scope versus reporting, it's blooming hard. Reporting scope 3 emissions, for everybody, that's really hard, and because it requires you really understanding lots of things about your customers and suppliers and everybody else. But if it becomes normal and it's what people do in the way they exchange data, then, and again, to your point, that might be something where AI can do a really good job of, taking data that you've got and extracting the value out of it and making sure that it's compliant and so on. Because, if you get it right, AI will make you compliant, because it will either be compliant or it won't be compliant.
It won't be compliant, yes.
It's like, that's it. You've said you wanted these things in it and these things are in it. And if they're not in it, then it'll tell you. So, I think it's definitely onerous. And I think any regulator or regulatory environment has to be conscious of making sure that it doesn't overwhelm people with stuff to be able to communicate. But ultimately, if you build it back to your stakeholder trust, if we can get to the point where people do feel that they're getting the right information and it's got guardrails around it and so on, that's done, because of good regulation, then that will be a good thing in the future, I think, for stakeholders to feel trust in it. Because if you're someone who invests and you want to make sure that people are compliant with the things we talked about, everything from modern slavery to environmental damage, if the guidelines force that to be visible, then it's very transparent to you. If it's not visible, then it's like, really, I'm not sure I really know whether this is true or not. But getting to it can be painful, and I wouldn't underestimate that. It's not easy, and that's why regulators have to be smart.
Yes, we have a number of questions coming in, actually. One of them is around the whole notion of ethical leadership. And it says, do you think ethical leadership that exemplifies ethical behavior and integrity sets the tone for stakeholder trust and organizational culture?
Yeah, I mean, it must do, I think. One would hope that as I said earlier, modern leadership, I think, is much more about transparency and authenticity and so on, as opposed to, language or statements or hierarchies and so on.
Yeah.
So I think you might have in the past trusted something because it was an institution, because it had hierarchies and it must be good. It's a big company and they've got all this. But, we know how that's been undermined so often in recent times.
Yes.
By saying, really, is that institution, is it really just too much of an institution now and doesn't really understand what it's doing? And I think that transparency through to real individuals or to authentic language or authentic leadership is much more compelling for people. Again, it's not easy to do. It's not a sort of simple thing. It just says, if you've got an ethical leader, everything will be fine, because that leader or leadership team need to demonstrate that and need to continually challenge themselves on it. Yeah. But I think the fact that it's more that the nature of what people expect from leadership now is much more transparent and authentic and open is a very powerful thing. And, all this sort of pluses and minuses of the social media world we live in, are difficult, but ultimately the sort of underlying trend of that is to make human beings more visible to people, if you know what I mean, the real essence of a human being. And so I think, to answer the question, I mean, if ethical leadership and demonstration of that and reinforcement of that on a continuous basis, I think is very powerful, and I think should be a strong sort of reinforcement to stakeholders that the company is sound. But I think the opposite of that, if you really felt that your leaders weren't guided by ethical principles, I think nowadays you would feel very undermined if that was the case.
Someone just from coming in from the Instagram live stream asked whether or not you have ever been put in your career as a leader, if you've ever been put in a situation where you had to make a choice between doing what's right in terms of your personal values versus the business or the company, and how did you kind of navigate that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I've got any examples where it was like, you're asking me to do this and I'm not comfortable doing it. I mean, I think there are definitely examples in my career where, whether it be as a leadership team or a board, we've had to be very honest about our motivation for doing things. I mean, the thing that most executives deal with, let alone boards, is company restructuring. When you have to make people redundant, when you have to restructure an organization. I mean, that's a horrible thing to do for any human being. And I think, and it's horrible for the individuals. And that didn't mean that, so for me as an individual, when I had to go through those sorts of things, I mean, that was really tough, and I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to do it. And as a human being, I didn't want to say, I'm sorry, you haven't got a job anymore. And, we're going to have to try and, sustain the company. But what you wanted to do in the kind of, back to the last question of the kind of ethical part of it, say, well, how can we do this better than anybody else can do it? How do we make sure that we're honest with people about the reasoning for it? How do we give them the best landing we can give them, whether it be, help and assistance in finding a new job or communicating or giving them time or whatever? Those are not easy to do, but I think worth going that extra mile for. And I know in, the companies I was involved in, I wasn't senior enough in the days that IBM first started making people redundant. Like I was at IBM, it was a long time ago. But when I was at Cisco and we started restructuring the company, which, we'd been growth forever and ever. And then suddenly, that didn't work because customer bases were changing and cost bases were changing and customer pricing was changing. Obviously markets like, the financial crisis and the dot-com crisis and all these sorts of things happened. You had to do something about it to keep the company sustainable. Yeah. But I think what we tried to do in those places was to be as honest and do the best possible job of it with the biggest amount of respect we had for the individuals that were involved in it. And that's, an important thing to always guide yourself against, I think.
Yes, I agreed. The other point that seems to be coming across, and you did mention it, is the whole notion around whether or not you think as a board the foundation for building trust among stakeholders is accountability and transparency first and foremost. And what are your thoughts around that?
Yes, I guess is the obvious answer, that accountability and transparency for the board should be the essence of building that kind of trust model. I guess the honest truth is sometimes it can be a bit mechanical, if you know what I mean. If a company is going along well, you have board meetings and you talk about subjects and you do the best to do what you're doing. It's sort of not necessarily very visible that that's part of a process of building trust or engagement. But I think what it is more is that if that kind of ongoing process is supporting the company in its ability to execute effectively and fulfill its vision and obligations and place in society, then it will become visible in the bigger part. So I don't think I'm really answering the question, but yeah, I mean, the answer is clearly yes, that, that sort of transparency and accountability is important. And I guess if it really badly failed, if a company, and we've seen it before, if a company doesn't do something and there's some scandal or whatever, and then the board are not recognised, and that doesn't mean that the board, all have to step down or whatever. I mean, that's, the extreme example of it. But if the board is somehow not connected to that, then that doesn't seem right, does it? I mean, people are going to say, well, what is your view on it and why are you not, involved in it? And but it is difficult, because management of communication, again, is not an easy thing to do, and just randomly engaging in conversations is not an easy thing to do as well. But I think if boards are congruent with the vision and the ethics and the, all of the principles of a company, then it should be visible and they should be accountable for it. And if those things are not being fulfilled, then, the board have to take responsibility for it, I think.
Completely. And there are just too many examples of where things go wrong and the board is either completely silent or they kind of are not transparent and accountable about it. The one thing that jumps to mind, which I think is a good kind of example, is the issue with the CEO of BP that just happened a few weeks ago, and the resignation. The board, came out up front and said, we accept, his resignation. It's not in line with BP's ethos, et cetera, et cetera. And I when I saw that, I was like, yeah, that looks like a really good example of the board just being completely accountable and being very transparent. They even said, the fact that, they missed that and they didn't realize how they did. So for me, it's
a really interesting point, and I think it's something that's very important. I think, business in its responsible nature is something that I'm involved with an organization. I think I don't know if you came across when we were chatting last week, but a small group of people we set up called Vocal, which is really about trying to give a voice to responsible business, not in the way that we're talking about here, but more in the bigger dialogue of, when we're talking in society about the role of business, because, business is easily characterized as, a bunch of, money grabbing capitalists, if you will, and or as a bunch of people who are not involved.
Yes.
Is we know business is a crucial part of society. It's a crucial part of, job creation and health and money, and wealth creation and so on. Yeah. So somehow finding how business fits into that is important. And this thing we're involved in Vocal is really about trying to give, particularly the next generation or the new generation of leaders, a much more conscious voice in the next generation of debate. Because if we leave it all to politicians and people in the media, it's going to be highly polarized. And of course, social media polarizes it even further. So it's very easy to say, I'm completely anti-Brexit or I'm completely Brexit. It's like you've got to be one or the other, right at the far end of that scale. And in reality, there's people going, well, actually, there are issues with here and we need to solve that, So we need a more balanced debate, and we need business to be able to have that without seeing it as some, self-interest thing.
Yes, absolutely.
It's about business is important. It's an important part of society. I mean, okay, you can poo-poo it if you want, but the reality is it's an important part of what we all do. It's what gives us jobs and houses and wealth and, sustainability and so on.
And all the social services from the taxes that it pays and all of that. So, yeah.
Exactly. But it's so easy as a media environment or social media or whatever to over-characterize that and say, it's all they're all just about profits all the time. And I don't think that's what business is really about. I really don't. I don't think that's the way most people in business think,
Yeah, that's true. So we're coming close to time, and I have two more points I'd like to ask you. One is, do you think that there's any kind of measurement that boards could use to kind of, measure how, call it the trust barometer then between them and stakeholders? I know none exists, but is there anything in your mind that you think, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, that boards could look to use?
Yeah, it's again a good question. I mean, obviously, there's been stuff that's gone into not regulation necessarily, but good practice around things like board effectiveness reviews and so on, and which are good, and obviously, sort of regular stakeholder communication is also good. It's not particularly systematic or kind of scientific, if you will, is probably the best way of putting it. And I do wonder whether that's one of the areas where technology and the more advanced technology could play a better part, about what's the sentiment look like? How do you feel about that? I mean, we obviously talk in consumer terms or in business terms about things like net promoter scores and so on. And they're kind of scores that are slightly abstract, but they represent a kind of essence of somebody being happy with something. Yeah, it feels to me like there are obviously external measures that people have, and in board effectiveness reviews, you can use external organizations who will benchmark you against others and so on.
Yeah, those like Bloomberg, of course.
Yeah, no, yeah, exactly. So those are good things to do, and I think benchmarking on the whole is something that's very positive for people. If you benchmark yourself against others in your industry or others of your size or others in your country or whatever, it's a useful thing to do. Why are we not doing that? Why are we less effective in this than others? That's a very good question to ask. I don't know whether it's a sort of, a public score, if you will, that you have in the same way. But I think, it feels to me like there's something in that area that could be better articulated or used more effectively or, balanced in a way that that is helpful. And and yeah, as you say, there's some great organizations around who'll do that sort of thing with it.
You're so spot on, because what we find is that when we do board evaluation, that's standard in our board benchmarking and doing the stakeholder engagement. A lot of other organizations, when they do board evaluations, they just focus on the nucleus of the board and not, the whole stakeholder engagement. And we find when we do that, the boards find it so useful to them, the data that comes back, and we use surveys and scorecards, etc. The last thing I'd just like you to just kind of think about and probably share is, like, as a chair, what are some of the things that you are concerned about? What are some of the, whether future trends that you're thinking of, or, putting on the agenda as chair?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think as a chair, you're a bit of a kind of I don't mean this in any pejorative sense, but you should, in theory, be a bit of the grown-up in the room, because there are clearly things that are, that can get a little bit fragmented at times in terms of businesses. And, that's important that you do perform a bit of that role. But I think, as a chairman, I think we need to be really very conscious of the number of pressures on companies today. I was going to say they're probably more than ever. Maybe they're not. Maybe there's always been different pressures, but the visibility of those pressures now, from the things that you talked about earlier about, reporting and governance, global pressures, big macro changes in environment, huge technological pressures. I really don't think that most people are able to embrace fully, and that's why I think it's step by step. You just have to do stuff, always keep just doing it. I mean, because, it's easy to get overwhelmed by things in the world. There's an awful lot going on. And if you kind of read the kind of all the stuff that's going on in AI, I mean, most people would just go and bury themselves in a little hole somewhere, and
because I kind of stopped reading after a while, because this is just
it's huge, but it's fascinating and interesting, and I really enjoy it from a technological perspective. But it's something that it's part of the pressures of the world, and who knows what will happen, whether it's obviously big tensions like the Ukraine war or the Taiwan challenges in semiconductors, those big macro things, let alone climate change and the climate emergency. I mean, that is a huge pressure, but it's a potentially massive rallying point as well.
I think so.
In the Royal Academy, we talk with a bunch of other societies, the Royal Society, the other academies and so on. And we're saying, actually, the climate emergency could be the biggest rallying point for everyone, because, it's everything from the way that business performs to the way that our arts and society help us to tell stories about each other and keep people healthy mentally, to the way that we, behave physically and so on, and we exercise or we communicate or we live in cities. I mean, all of these things are huge, and the climate emergency might be the way of saying, we really need to think holistically in the system about all this stuff, because actually, if we don't, we're probably going to struggle to navigate through what's going to be a pretty complex world,
Yeah, it's going to be a very kind of interesting next couple of years, with all of these moving parts, AI, ESG, the new governance standards, and also the pressures coming in from stakeholders from one direction to the other, and especially in the areas that you play a lot around the technology space, you're going to be kept very busy. I'm pretty sure.
I do tell my wife, but she's reminds me periodically. I retired a few years ago, but.
Exactly. Like, what's that? What's retirement? Listen, Phil, thank you so much. And for those of you who joined us live on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, thank you so much for joining in. This episode of the forum will be up on our YouTube channel, and we'll be preparing a keynote, some key takeaways, a paper from this that we'll email to all of you who joined us. So thank you so much for being part of today's enlightening session. As they would say in Jamaica, where I'm from, big up Phil for all your great insights and all your amazing tips as usual. Can definitely see your experience coming out. So until next time, let's stay motivated, let's stay connected, and remember that being good is better for business. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for joining us. You can also reach us and find out more about us via our website, lumerous.com.